So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome to Researchers Desk today Andrew Simms and Anna Jonsson from New Weather. And Anna and Andrew are going to talk with us today about badvertising. And we're super interested to hear what you're both going to tell us. My understanding is, Andrew, you're going to start, and then Anna, you're going to take over from there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn my own video camera off, but I'm here in the background, and and any problems at all, I'll just suddenly appear, or if you feel lost, just say something and I will be right and I will appear again on your screen. So a warm welcome to Researchers Desk. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and it's good to know that there's going to be a ghost in the machine that can solve all technological problems as we go. And I apologize for the slightly blinding light. It's because I'm sat right in a window. And I wanted to start by saying that I'm going to give a kind of an overview of the issue, quite a broad one. But I wanted to say straight away that it's quite a dynamic one, the issue that we're going to be talking about, and things are sort of happening very much at the moment, almost on a day-to-day basis. Anna will talk a little bit later, I think, about some of the work that we've done which relates to high carbon advertising and sponsorship around winter sports. And we ourselves published a report about this at the weekend, which I'm not going to go into. I'm going to leave that to Anna, but also to say that as part of this issue, one of the things that we're doing as a campaign is lobbying for towns and cities to adopt policies which restrict high carbon advertising. And there's a rough rule of thumb when we talk about high carbon advertising, and I'll say more about this. We're talking about fossil fuel companies and high carbon products and lifestyles, such as airlines and car makers. And just yesterday, the city of Sheffield, which is a major city in the north of England, just passed a policy which was to ban high carbon advertising on public advertising sites which are owned by the council. This is a number of outdoor sites, and there are policies which have already been passed by a number of other major cities, not just in the UK, but in the Netherlands and in Sweden and in many other countries, places around the world, including kind of Australia and the States. So it's a very dynamic process. And also then, literally about an hour ago, I heard news that some of our colleagues that work on this issue in the Netherlands, who had taken a case against the Dutch airline KLM for making misleading environmental claims in their advertising about the environmental performance of the airline and aviation more broadly, and they've just won a case, and the Dutch courts have ruled against KLM for making misleading claims. So for some people, this might be a relatively new issue, but it's a very dynamic one, and there's quite a lot going on about it. And hopefully, I'll
Looks like we've just lost Andrew. Anna, you're muted.
I think so. Yes, just responding.
So we're just going to wait a second while Andrew gets his connectivity sorted out. He did say he was broadcasting to us from an uncomfortable location. So we'll just stand by. And I'll just write in the chat that he's not being heard. He's worked it out. Good. You're muted at the moment, Andrew. Will you just put the thing on pause if you unmute yourself?
There we go. Sorry. Yes, I think the signal just dropped for a moment there. So apologies for that.
That sort of thing happens. You just carry on. I'll just turn off and carry on.
Yeah, I'll just keep blithely continuing as if nothing happened at all. So what I was saying was that generally good life advice is that if you're in a hole, stop digging. But it seems to us that this is a piece of advice which the advertising industry has overlooked. We look back to 2023, it was the hottest year globally on record. We're seeing some science at the moment that says that the temperature anomaly last year doesn't fit any of the current models, and that climate researchers are extremely worried that there may be things happening, dynamics having been triggered that we don't understand. understand. So we're in a very perilous situation. And we look back over last year, and there was a sort of monstrous convoy of wildfires and floods and other climate-borne cataclysms that have been rampaging around the world. And so anyone with a kind of an interest in holding the fabric of civilization together, we might think twice about actively promoting the products and lifestyles that make the situation worse. Not so advertising. And our argument is that perhaps when you look at the history of advertising, maybe we should not be surprised, because some of the early theorists and practitioners of advertising and marketing were pretty open about their intentions. We go back to the early 1900s, and a man called Ernest Elmo Calkins, he characterized the industry as consumption engineers. They were trying to engineer consumption to increase our consumption. And if there was no automatic demand for a product, advertising could create it artificially. Engineered shifts in fashion, upselling, upgrades, a sort of form of designed-in obsolescence, an actual built-in obsolescence where a product's life was deliberately limited. And this would kind of keep people buying and running around and on the work and spend treadmill. Now, shortly after Calkins, we have this very interesting chap called Edward Bernays. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he applied knowledge and experience from running propaganda and psychological warfare campaigns for Woodrow Wilson's United States government during the First World War. And he applied these techniques to manipulating public opinion and behavior and engineering consent around issues in peace times. And in a sort of a very deft act to make the emerging advertising industry proud, he rebranded what had been understood as propaganda as public relations, of which the advertiser's art was a key part. And to sort of cut a very long story short, to shopping's short-lived dopamine hit, the effectiveness of advertising is one of the main reasons why we keep buying stuff far beyond either what we need or what might actually improve our life satisfaction. Now, there's a lot of evidence that materialistic values, those espoused in advertising, that sort of nervous, status-obsessed backdrop to consumerism, in fact, have the opposite effect, that they undermine our well-being and they make us less social and less likely to behave in pro-environmental ways. And that this is a vicious circle in the sense that exposure to advertising heightens our materialistic values, which makes us more prone to advertising. And in the relatively short history, not much more than half a century, of a very particular economic model of debt-fueled hyper-consumerism, rising consumption per person in mostly the relatively wealthy countries has taken the world from living within its planetary ecological means as recently as back in the early 1970s to sort of busting planetary boundaries, busting the biosphere. The last time it was possible to get through a whole year without going into ecological debt, a bit like getting through the month without burning through your month's pay, was in the early 70s. We came up with a measure called Earth Overshoot Day, which measures when humanity collectively now goes into the environmental red. And that date in the year has been creeping ever earlier in the calendar. Since about 2001, it's been moving forward at the rate of about 3 days a year. In 2022, it fell on the 28th of July, meaning that in effect for the rest of the year, irreplaceable ecological resources were being depleted. Now, awareness of these things, the fact that we are rapidly consuming our way over the precipice of a climate catastrophe cliff, plus the way that to date the advertising industry has really avoided blame and responsibility for goading us towards that edge. It's why we started the campaign, Badvertising, why we've written a book about it, and why we're looking at how this issue plays out in a number of different areas, including specifically in the sort of the prime media real estate of the world of sport. Now, we've got an overwhelming scientific consensus that tells us that, in 1 year, there is a rapid, unprecedented, and immediate reduction in consumption of polluting products that is needed, alongside an equally urgent shift away from polluting lifestyles. But in the other ear, we've got the advertising industry loudly telling those who can afford it, and also those who can't, which has other disturbing and negative effects, to carry on just as we are, flying around the world on multiple holidays, buying huge sports utility vehicles, maybe 2 of them, maybe 1 for every member of the family, and consuming whatever we can. Now, from a historical perspective, hyperconsumerism may be only a couple of generations old, and it's still contained geographically to a minority of the world's wealthy populations, but it's been around long enough to develop ingrained consumption habits and economic path dependency. So that now, sudden drops in overconsumption, such as during the COVID pandemic, can send shockwaves and quickly it dispels these sort of self-glorifying deregulated market myths and reveals the degree to which the public realm, the public sector, and the state really do underpin things. Now, this is worth remembering when we consider a necessary change, such as the re-regulation of harmful advertising, which is what we're effectively arguing for, or when politicians decry that we're either powerless in the face of market forces or that we shouldn't meddle in them. Now, we would argue quite the opposite. We, the public and our elected officials, have far more right and agency to do so than politics generally likes to admit. And in terms of trying to sort of conceptualize the sort of shift in consumption that we want to help bring about through the more effective regulation of harmful advertising, it's worth remembering that according to the climate scientist Kevin Anderson, that if just the richest 10th of the planet, the richest 1 in 10 of the planet, reduced consumption to the average EU level, that alone would cut global emissions by about 30%. So the need to reduce the advertising of harmful products has already now been acknowledged officially, if briefly, by our own government, the UK government. In 2021, there was a team within the government system called the Behavioural Insights Team. Now, it was known as the Nudge Unit. And that's in honour to this popular economic notion that we can achieve an awful lot to change with lots of little small actions that the public would barely notice. And then within a government department, it published a report called Net Zero: Principles for Successful Behavioural Change Initiatives. And remembering that this is a department that was called the Nudge Unit, it concluded, and I quote, "We do not have time to nudge our way to net zero." So extraordinarily, you had the Nudge Unit was questioning its very purpose in existing, saying that nudging was not enough to win a safe climate. And it went on to say, and I quote, "Looking at past government-led initiatives, significant societal behaviour changes related to, for instance, reductions in harm from smoking, increasing worker or motor vehicle safety, or uptake of vaccinations, these have all involved taxes, bans, mandates, and other regulatory measures beyond persuasion." But that message, unfortunately, for our government at the time, was decidedly off message. We had a Conservative government, and that report that was published within about a day was unpublished. And the Nudge Unit itself was removed from Whitehall, which is our sort of official government system, and put at a safe distance under the umbrella of a research body. But its message, however, has since grown clearer and stronger. And just last year, in a new report on how to build a net zero society, the Behavioural Insights team recommended the regulation of advertising and greenwash, saying that the UK should, and again I quote, "in addition to cracking down on all forms of greenwashing, follow other countries' leads by restricting advertising of high emitting sectors, explore the benefits of banning fossil fuel ads, and in time, advertising from firms within key sectors, for example, air travel, who fail to meet decarbonisation targets compatible with UK carbon budgets." So there we've got from the heart of a kind of research unit, a research community, an understanding that the regulation of advertising is a necessary condition to enable society to shift to climate safe behaviours. Now, they're not the only ones. by then, in response to the sort of calls that the Badvertising campaign has been making, the United Kingdom's second tier of government, the sort of the second chamber, the House of Lords, its Environment Committee had already concluded in 2022 a report into behaviour change that, and again I quote, government should introduce measures to regulate advertising of high carbon and environmentally damaging products. Now, at this point, you might be forgiven for thinking that this is a lot of fuss about something that could appear marginal in comparison to, say, the actions of oil companies themselves. And the latter, of course, need rapid action too. But advertising is more powerful, we argue, in controlling our behavior and creating a world in which climate-destroying pollution seems normal than most people are aware of. There's a lovely taster of this, and if you think people can sort of filter out advertising, I would invite you to go onto YouTube and watch a short video by a fantastic group called Bite Back 2030, and it's called the Triple Dipped Chicken Experiment, in which a group of UK teenagers were asked to come to a London restaurant, and they were invited to order a dish from a long list of options on the menu, but one of the options had already been comprehensively and subliminally advertised to them beforehand, like on their journey, in the back of cabs, over the radio, and through their social media feeds. Now, every single person taking part in that exercise, when they got to the restaurant, were offered a menu which had about 50 options on it. Every one of them chose triple dipped chicken. They'd been primed unconsciously to make this choice by advertising. Or, for example, you could take a rather fun, innovative study that sought to understand the power of brands to influence behavior. Red Bull, you'll be familiar with, it's a high sugar caffeine drink that health experts warn against long-term consumption of. And it markets itself through sponsorship of extreme and dangerous sports with the tagline, Red Bull gives you wings. There's this wonderful experiment and some research conducted in the United States in which young college-age video gamers were given functionally identical cars within a game to drive. Only the branding on the cars was different. Now, the players behind the wheel of the Red Bull branded cars displayed the brand characteristics of speed, power, aggressiveness, and risk-taking. And compared to other differently branded cars, and this is the research paper I'm quoting, what we see is that people racing the Red Bull car race faster and more aggressively, sometimes recklessly, and this is the killer thing for me, and they either do very, very well, or they push themselves too far and crash. That was the researcher. Adam Brazel is assistant professor of marketing at Boston College. Now, crucially, the subjects in the study were not aware that they were behaving differently. The changes in behavior resulted from non-conscious brand priming. Now, like drivers under the influence of alcohol and perhaps overconfident of their abilities to be fully in control, we systematically underestimate the degree to which our choices and actions are controlled by advertising. And now I'm going to quote you from a paper from 2003 from a study called Brands on the Brain by Tim Ambler and Andreas Ioannidis and Stephen Rose. And they make the point, after they've done some experiments using neurological images of the brain to reveal the impacts of advertising, they say, scary as it may sound, if an ad does not modify the brains of the intended audience, then it has not worked. For me, one of the great ironies of this is that politicians who hate the idea, the thought of public interventions to like controls on products and labeling and advertising bans, who they might dismiss this as like, we can't tell people what to do. Those same people are blithely happy for the population to swim in a sea of highly coercive commercial advertising. I suppose I'd say we think of advertising as a form of brain pollution and its controlling effects in encouraging ultimately self-destructive behavior. We likened in one of our early pieces of work on this to try and communicate the issue to a sort of so-called zombie fungus cordyceps, which is known for sort of taking over the bodies and minds of insects, which drives them to their own destruction. So what should we do about it? Well, most basically, we believe that there needs to be a tobacco-style ban on high-carbon products and lifestyles, and that such a ban was a vital element of the broader measures to reduce smoking. And we would argue that the air pollution from burning fossil fuels alone, before you even look at other global heating impacts, is thought to kill as many, if not more people than tobacco use today. Estimates vary from between around 5 and to over 8 million people per year, like a really significant cause of premature death. But we would also argue that the current system of day-to-day advertising self-regulation, most advertising bodies are self-regulators, very often funded by the industry they're supposed to be regulating. It's a kind of, it means that we've got an industry which is marking its own homework, because very often the self-regulators are staffed by people who have come from the industry as well, that it isn't working and it needs a huge overhaul. We think it acts frequently too late. In many cases, the damage has already been done, and the few number of successful rulings against adverts can come, up to a year after a misleading or false advert has been published. We looked at the UK and we found that far too few misleading green claims are actually followed up. We looked at 1 year, 503 environmental cases were raised in 2022. 87% of those were not investigated. Only 12, that was about 2.5%, led to formal action. The process was also very unclear. There's a lack of transparency and consistency as to which ads are investigated and which are not. There are a lot of loopholes where a lot of things which are effectively advertising don't get regulated at all. Lack of transparency and consistency. The self-regulator is also too hands tied. It can't suspend ads pending an investigation or in order to prevent future breaches. The system's also really too hopeful. It relies a lot on the deterrent effect, in which a few selective judgments are meant to prevent repeat offences. We've already seen this failing to work in the case of a complaint which we successfully brought against some fossil fuel industry advertising with the Financial Times. We saw a case where within a month, virtually identical adverts were run after a successful ruling. So in practice, it doesn't work. You get these sort of repeat offences. The system's also very difficult and it's very unequal. It requires a lot of knowledge on the part of the people making complaints. It's largely reactive. It relies on concerned groups and individuals who've got the time and the expertise in order to submit detailed complaints. It's got a very narrow remit, and we think it's insufficient to address high carbon advertising. Like a lot of sponsorship material, an area that we are working on heavily in the field of sport, which is advertising by another name, sort of gets excluded. And you sort of, and this is one of the things that we've noticed, and once you start looking, you can't miss it. If you look at how many fossil fuel companies, airlines and car makers get on TV by sponsoring sport, and therefore get access to audiences in the hundreds of millions, sometimes the billions. And if those platforms are not based in your country, then the regulator will not rule over them. So there's a real problem. Now, to put this right, we think we need more effective rules, a more empowered regulator. And in addition to tobacco-style controls on high-carbon advertising, we need properly resourced regulators who are truly independent from industry. We think we need to close loopholes that allow bad ads to slip through the net, and more enforcement powers to suspend, fine, and remove badverts. The system needs to be more proactive rather than the reactive fashion that it's got at the moment. But the good news is that we know ending harmful advertising works. Now, for example, as we outline in the Badvertising book, that in the US, research on exposure to television advertising. Television advertising has been described as perhaps the single largest factor in the epidemic of obesity among children. But when Transport for London, which is the body overseeing the London Underground, kind of the bus networks, the transport estate, introduced a ban on junk food advertising, in a fairly short period of time, it was found that on average, households consumed 1,000 calories less per week. So we know that if we remove this harmful advertising, which is the most effective approach, it really does work. Now, just to sum up, I'd say that there are many very, very difficult things that we have to do to prevent a climate catastrophe. We need to re-engineer our energy systems. We need to re-engineer our transport systems. We need to retrofit our homes. Our point in this campaign, I think, is that one of the very simplest things that we could do, the sort of low-hanging fruit, will be if we just stopped promoting our own self-destruction by ending adverts of the most polluting things. Now, this wouldn't, it's like the ban on tobacco advertising. It wouldn't end their sale, but it would stop the additional overconsumption that results from the marketing. And as I mentioned, climate scientist Kevin Anderson pointed out, we get this huge cut just by defaulting back to EU level. So that's it. That's my whirlwind tour of our argumentation of our campaign. If anybody is interested, we'd very strongly invite you to sign up to our newsletter or get in touch. Like I say, it's a very dynamic issue. We're looking at things constantly all the time. There are new cases coming up, and we're experimenting with different ways of bringing these messages forward. We want to see legislative action at both the local, city, regional, national, and international level. And things are happening. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Thank you. New Weather Sweden, we started off working with this issue 3 years ago. And as Andrew said in the very beginning, so much has happened during these years. And I would just say, like, the big argument for both me and my colleague Gunnar, who both of us have been working lots and lots within the political system, both the Swedish parliament and the government. For us, I think the real big motivation of working with this issue is what also Andrew described, how these fossil fuel ads influence our minds, our values, and how this also is an obstacle when trying to introduce the radical climate policy we need. Just all the discussions we have had on like kind of low levels of air travel taxes in Sweden is just one example. There are many of them. But just a few examples on what has happened and happening in Sweden. We started off working with the local ad bans, since Amsterdam is a very big inspiration when they introduce a local ad ban in the subway. And actually, we now have one, or there will be one in Sweden. So it's the region of Stockholm, who after lots of campaigning now have decided to exclude in their next contract with their, how do you say, the one doing the advertising, or having the contract to ban ads for fossil fuels and fossil powered products. So that will be from 2026, I think. And there's ongoing processes in both the municipality of Stockholm and Gothenburg. And I think actually the argumentation from Åsa Lindhagen at the city of Stockholm is very, very good, since they have consumption-based targets on the inhabitants of Stockholm. She just stated that, I mean, it's counterproductive for us as a city to have this kind of ads that also fuel the emissions from our inhabitants that we politically are trying to diminish. So, but they have some kind of legal challenges. If anyone wants to know more about them, just contact me. I could never describe it in English, but I can do it in Swedish if you would like to. Then we also, that's kind of also the big focus for the 3 coming years. We are doing, highlighting the fossil fuel sponsorships within winter sports. It's such a big irony that we have, like, as you know, Vasaloppet, which is sponsored by Prem and Volvo. It has been lots of discussion on that. And also the Swedish Ski Association, sponsored by Ford and are in partnership with SAS. And it's such a big irony seeing all these young, wonderful winter sports athletes in this snowy, like going downhill or going skiing, and then they have their badges of big fossil fuel companies destroying the snow that this whole sport is dependent on. So, and I really think it's something that works, and we're also in discussion like with directly with the Swedish Ski Association, and things are happening. So and also this Saturday, actually, just a few days ago, we launched a report called Dirty Snow, together with Andrew and the UK Badvertising people. And it paints the picture. And it also, for the first time, calculating actually how much carbon emissions you have from fossil fuel sponsorships. So if you want to just go into that, it's very fresh. It's like the first time to just try to set a figure on this, and it's also after discussions with the Swedish Ski Association that actually there were no figures on this. So, and we think it's really crucial to find this figure. And just for an example, the International Ski and Snowboard Federation FIS is in agreement with the big car company Audi, and they get like 5 to 7 million euros per year from this agreement. And the calculation we have showed that this agreement gives extra carbon emission of about 103,000 to 144,000 tons a year. So it's just like an example, and you can find more in the report as well. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think it's more important to let you in so that we have time for questions, and really nice to see you all.
Well, that was an absolutely super inspiring talk. I'm super impressed. Massive congratulations, Anna, on the success in Stockholm. I mean, a ban on fossil fuel ads in Stockholm, what an achievement. And reflecting back in a few words, you said, Andrew, that about the tobacco industry killing warming, artificial warming caused by humans is killing more people. This is the tip of the iceberg. Presently, one in 9 species is facing extinction already today because of our actions, and this, of course, just gets worse with time. So fantastic work. Thank you so much for being at Research Desk today.